My name is Jordan Blake, and at my grandfather's funeral, I sat in the back row while my family fought over his empire in whispers. They spoke around me, through me, past me, like I was just another mourner who'd wandered in from the street. For years, I'd been the grandchild nobody quite remembered to invite. The one whose accomplishments were met with polite nods before the conversation shifted back to my cousins. But my grandfather saw me. He always had. And when his lawyer stood up to read the letter that would change everything, I watched my aunt's face drain of color as she realized that the person she'd been ignoring all morning now controlled everything she'd spent decades trying to claim. One letter. 3 companies. And suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain started just as we pulled up to Riverside Memorial Chapel. Not a downpour, just that persistent autumn drizzle that makes everything look gray and tired. My father parked at the far end of the lot. Even though there were closer spaces available. He always did that, kept us at the margins, like we were perpetually arriving late to our own family. My mother adjusted her black scarf in the visor mirror, her lips pressed thin. She hadn't said much during the drive from our apartment in Hartford. None of us had. Grief has a way of filling a car without needing words. But this wasn't just grief. This was something else. Something that tasted like dread and old resentment. Inside the chapel, the air smelled of lilies and furniture polish. The casket sat at the front, closed, surrounded by enormous floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I recognized the names on the cards without having to look closely. Harrison Manufacturing. Summit Tech Solutions. Clearwater Properties. My grandfather's companies, sending their respects in the language they knew best. Expensive and visible. The pews were already filling up. I spotted Uncle Marcus near the front, his silver hair perfectly styled even in mourning, shaking hands with men in dark suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a Fortune 500 boardroom. Aunt Victoria stood beside him, her black dress probably designer, her pearls definitely real. Accepting condolences with the gracious nod of someone who'd been preparing for this role her entire life. My cousin Tristan sat in the second row, his arm around his mother's shoulders, looking appropriately somber in a way that seemed rehearsed. He'd always been good at that, performing the right emotion at the right time. Next to him, Natalie scrolled through her phone with the screen dimmed, probably checking her social media, making sure her grief was photogenic and shareable. She'd already posted a tribute to Grandpa Bill that morning. A throwback photo of them at some charity gala, captioned with something about legacy and love. It had thousands of likes before breakfast. We took our seats in the back. Not because we arrived late, we were actually early, but because that's where we always ended up. The Blake side of the family, my father's side, had always been the lesser branch. My father was the youngest, the one who'd chosen teaching over corporate ambition, who'd married a librarian instead of someone with connections. In the Harrison family hierarchy, that made us tolerable but not essential, present but not important. I'd grown up watching my father shrink himself at family gatherings, watching my mother smile through casual dismissals, watching myself become a footnote in a story that centered around Tristan's business school achievements and Natalie's influencer career. The service began with a minister, who clearly hadn't known my grandfather personally. He spoke in broad strokes about William Harrison's contributions to the community, his business acumen, his dedication to family. It was the kind of eulogy that could have been for anyone, and maybe that was appropriate. My grandfather had been a private man, not given to sentimentality or public displays. But I knew a different version of him. The man who'd spent Saturday mornings teaching me chess in his study while everyone else was at Tristan's soccer games. The man who'd asked about my work with genuine curiosity, who'd actually read the market analysis reports I'd sent him, who'd called me every few weeks just to talk about economic trends and political shifts. When Uncle Marcus stood to give his remarks, his voice carried that smooth corporate confidence that made boardrooms lean forward. He talked about his father's vision, his integrity, his ability to build something lasting. He mentioned the family business, how it had grown under Grandpa's leadership, how it would continue to thrive as they honored his memory. The subtext was clear. We, meaning Marcus and Victoria and their children, would be stewarding this legacy. The Harrison name would remain strong in the right hands. I noticed he didn't mention my father once. 30 years of being brothers, and David Blake didn't even merit a footnote in Marcus's narrative. After the service, people lingered in clusters, trading stories and business cards. I watched Aunt Victoria move through the crowd like a politician, touching arms, leaning in close, her grief perfectly calibrated to maintain dignity while accepting sympathy. She'd always been the family's unofficial matriarch, the one who organized holidays and enforced traditions, who decided which cousins got invited to which events. My mother had learned years ago not to expect invitations to the inner circle gatherings. We got the big events, the weddings and funerals, but not the intimate dinners or weekend trips to the beach house. A man I didn't recognize approached Uncle Marcus, and I overheard fragments of their conversation. Something about transition plans, about maintaining stability during this difficult time, about meetings scheduled for next week. Marcus nodded with the assured gravity of someone who'd already mapped out the future. Beside him, Tristan stood straighter, his jaw set in that determined way he had, like he was already mentally sitting in the CEO's chair. No one approached me. A few distant relatives nodded in my direction. The kind of acknowledgement you give to someone you think you should probably know but can't quite place. One of my grandfather's old colleagues stopped to shake my father's hand, said something kind about Bill being proud of him. My father thanked him quietly. Later, I'd learned that colleague had been trying to reach my father for years, but Aunt Victoria had made sure those connections never solidified. Can't have the junior branch getting too comfortable. The reception was held at the Harrison estate, the sprawling property in Ashford Hills that had been in the family for 3 generations. The house sat on 5 acres all. Manicured lawns and old oak trees, the kind of place that whispered old money without having to shout. Inside, the rooms were filled with dark wood paneling and oriental rugs, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Caterers moved efficiently through the space, offering wine and small plates to guests who murmured condolences while eyeing the artwork. I found myself in the corner of the main parlor, holding a glass of water I didn't really want, watching my family perform their roles. Natalie had stationed herself near the fireplace where the lighting was best, accepting sympathies with practiced vulnerability, probably mentally composing her next post. Tristan worked the room with Uncle Marcus, being introduced to business associates, shaking hands with the kind of firm grip that suggested he was ready to take on responsibility. Aunt Victoria held court near the bay windows, surrounded by society women who'd known my grandfather through charity boards and country club committees. My mother stood with my father near the entrance to the dining room, present but peripheral, their faces composed in that neutral expression that comes from years of being included, but not embraced. I wanted to go to them, to stand together in our shared invisibility, but something kept me rooted. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the faint hope that someone, anyone, would remember I existed beyond being David Blake's kid. The one who'd gone into finance or consulting or whatever it was she did. That's when I saw Mr. Pem. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Pembroke. Arthur Pembroke had been my grandfather's attorney for over 30 years. A tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of quiet competence that doesn't need to announce itself. He stood near the doorway to my grandfather's study, scanning the room with deliberate attention. When his eyes found mine, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or purpose. He made his way toward me, moving through the crowd with polite efficiency. "Jordan Blake," he said when he reached me. His voice was low, meant just for my ears. "Your grandfather left specific instructions. I'll need you to join us in the study shortly. There's a letter." "Us?" I asked. "Your aunt and uncle. Your cousins." He paused. "And you. Specifically you." Before I could respond, he'd moved on, making his way toward Aunt Victoria. I watched him speak to her, watched her face shift from gracious hostility to sharp attention. She glanced across the room, and for the first time all day, her eyes locked on mine. Not past me, not through me. On me. Something cold settled in my chest. 20 minutes later, we gathered in my grandfather's study. The room still smelled like him. Leather and old books and the faint ghost of his cigars. His desk dominated the space, a massive mahogany piece covered with neat stacks of papers, and a vintage lamp that cast warm light across the dark wood. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes on economics, history, and philosophy, along with framed photographs from his life. I spotted one of me and him at my college graduation, his hand on my shoulder, both of us smiling. I hadn't known he'd kept that photo. Aunt Victoria sat in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, her posture rigid, her hands folded in her lap. Uncle Marcus stood behind her, one hand on the back of her chair, the other in his pocket, trying to look casual but coming off tense. Tristan leaned against the bookshelf with studied nonchalance. Natalie sat in the other chair, her phone finally put away, her expression carefully neutral. My parents stood near the door, unsure if they were supposed to be there. And I stood off to the side, near the window, watching the gray afternoon light filter through the old glass. Mr. Pembroke settled behind my grandfather's desk, opening a leather portfolio. He removed several documents and a sealed envelope, the old-fashioned kind with actual wax seal, my grandfather's initials pressed into red wax. William was very specific about how this should be handled, Pembroke began, his voice formal now, attorney mode fully engaged. He wanted his wishes communicated in his own words, so I'll be reading this letter in its entirety. After that, we'll discuss the legal documentation. Aunt Victoria leaned forward slightly. Arthur, perhaps we should handle the estate matters privately, with immediate family. Her tone suggested this was a reasonable request, that my parents and I should excuse ourselves. Pembroke looked at her over his glasses. Everyone in this room is mentioned in the letter, Victoria. William was quite clear about who should be present. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Uncle Marcus's jaw tightened. Tristan straightened up from his casual lean. Even Natalie looked up, suddenly alert. Pembroke broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper looked expensive, heavy stock, my grandfather's bold handwriting filling the pages in black ink. He cleared his throat and began to read. To my family, gathered in the place where I made most of my important decisions, I want to start by saying I've loved you all in my own way, even when that love was complicated by disappointment or frustration. I built something in this life. 3 companies that provide jobs for hundreds of people, that create value, that will outlast me. I've spent the last few years thinking carefully about what happens next, about who should carry this forward. Some of you assumed you knew the answer. You were wrong. I watched Aunt Victoria's knuckles turn white as she gripped the armrest. Uncle Marcus had gone very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before an explosion. Mr. Pembroke continued reading, his voice steady and professional, but I could hear my grandfather in every word, that direct way he had of cutting through pretense. Victoria, Marcus, you've spent decades positioning yourselves as the natural heirs to what I built. You've made assumptions about your importance, about your entitlement to the Harrison legacy. Victoria, you've run the family like a corporation, deciding who matters and who doesn't, who gets access and who gets excluded. You've used my name and my resources to build your social standing while treating your brother David like he was a mistake I made, something to be tolerated but never celebrated. Marcus, you've been competent in your role at Harrison Manufacturing. I won't take that from you, but competence isn't vision. You've maintained what I built, but you've never understood why I built it. You see numbers and market share. You've never once asked about purpose or responsibility. The room was so quiet I could hear the old clock on the mantel ticking. My father had moved slightly, his hand finding my mother's, their fingers intertwining with the practiced comfort of 30 years together. I wanted to look at Aunt Victoria's face, to see how she was processing this, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from Mr. Pembroke as he continued. Tristan, my grandson, I've watched you grow into a competent young man who knows how to present well, and say the right things. You have your mother's strategic mind and your father's polish. But I've also watched you treat people as stepping stones. I've seen how you talk about the factory workers, the administrative staff, the people who actually make things run. You'll inherit your parents' stock in the company, enough to be comfortable, but you're not ready to lead anything that requires actual empathy. Maybe you never will be. Tristan's face had gone red, a flush creeping up from his collar. He opened his mouth as if to protest, then seemed to remember his grandfather was dead and couldn't be argued with. Natalie shifted in her chair, suddenly looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Mr. Pembroke turned to the next page. Natalie, my dear granddaughter, you've built a life around being seen, around crafting an image of success that exists primarily on screens. There's nothing wrong with that in itself, but you've confused visibility with substance. You posted a photo of us together this morning, called it a tribute to legacy. We hadn't spoken in 8 months. You didn't return my calls. You were too busy curating a life that looks meaningful to spend time on actual meaning. You'll receive a trust fund, enough to maintain your lifestyle, but nothing that requires stewardship. I don't trust you with things that matter to people beyond yourself. Natalie's eyes were shining now, tears threatening to spill, but I couldn't tell if they were from hurt or anger or embarrassment. Mr. Pembroke paused, took a sip of water from a glass that had been waiting on the desk, then continued. The next part of the letter changed tone, became almost conversational, like Grandpa Bill was sitting right there with us. David, my youngest son, I owe you an apology I can't deliver in person now. I let Victoria and Marcus diminish you for years. I watched them treat you like you'd failed by choosing teaching over business, like marrying Patricia for love instead of advantage was somehow weakness. I should have stood up for you more firmly. I should have made it clear that building young minds mattered as much as building profit margins. You chose integrity over ambition, and I respected that even when I didn't say so clearly enough. You and Patricia raised a remarkable daughter, and I hope what comes next makes up in some small way for the years your family was pushed to the margins. My father's shoulders shook slightly. My mother pressed closer to him, her own eyes wet. I felt something tight in my chest loosening and constricting at the same time, pride and grief tangled together. Mr. Pembroke looked up briefly, his eyes finding mine, and something in his expression told me what was coming. He returned to the letter. Jordan Blake, my granddaughter, this is where everything changes. While your cousins were learning how to network and position themselves, you were learning how things actually work. You sent me your first market analysis when you were 22, fresh out of business school. A report on emerging markets in renewable energy that was better than anything my highly paid consultants had produced. You didn't send it to impress me. You sent it because we'd been talking about climate policy over chess, and you wanted to continue the conversation with data. I felt everyone's eyes on me now, but I kept staring at Mr. Pembroke, at the letter in his hands, unable to quite process what I was hearing. He kept reading. For the last 8 years, you've been working in strategic consulting, quietly building expertise in corporate restructuring and market analysis. You've advised firms through acquisitions, helped navigate regulatory challenges, assessed risk in ways that saved your clients millions. And you did it all while your family barely noticed you existed. At Christmas dinners, your aunt would ask what you were up to these days with that tone that implied you were probably still figuring things out. Your cousin Tristan once told people you did something with spreadsheets, like that was the extent of your contribution to the world. They never asked for details. They never wanted to know. But I asked. I always asked. You'd send me your analyses, your thoughts on market trends, your assessments of where different industries were heading. We'd spend hours on the phone talking about everything from supply chain vulnerabilities to the future of manufacturing in America. You understood what I was trying to build in a way no one else in this family did. Not just profit, but employment, stability, contribution. You saw the whole ecosystem, not just the bottom line. Mr. Pembroke turned to the final page, and I noticed his hands were completely steady even as mine had started shaking. The last section of the letter was shorter, more formal, like my grandfather had shifted into decision mode. Therefore, I am leaving controlling interest in Harrison Manufacturing, Summit Tech Solutions, and Clearwater Properties to Jordan Blake, effective immediately upon my death. She will hold 51% of each company, with full authority to make strategic decisions. The remaining shares will be distributed among family members as detailed in the legal documentation Arthur will provide. Marcus, you will retain your position as COO of Harrison Manufacturing, but you will report to Jordan. She has the authority to restructure leadership as she sees fit. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent in my ears. 3 companies. Controlling interest. I looked down at my hands, half expecting them to look different somehow, but they were just my hands, the same ones that had been holding a glass of water in the corner 20 minutes ago. Aunt Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is insane," she said, her voice tight and controlled in that way that meant she was furious. "Arthur, this can't possibly be legal. Jordan she's barely 30 years old. She has no experience running companies. This is clearly the decision of a man who wasn't in his right mind." Mr. Pembroke closed the letter carefully, folding it back into precise thirds. "William was completely lucid when he drafted this will, Victoria. I can provide medical documentation if you'd like to contest it, but I should warn you that doing so will be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful." He met with multiple doctors specifically to ensure his mental competence would be unquestionable. He knew exactly what he was doing. Uncle Marcus finally found his voice. "He's put an inexperienced consultant in charge of a $100 million manufacturing company. What happens when she makes a mistake? What happens to the people who depend on those jobs?" His tone was reasonable, concerned, the voice of a man thinking about the greater good. But I heard the edge underneath. This wasn't about the workers. This was about him. I spoke for the first time since entering the study. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I've spent the last 3 years specifically studying manufacturing sector transitions. I wrote the analysis that helped Meridian Industries restructure without layoffs when they were facing bankruptcy. I consulted on the Weber Automotive acquisition that saved 800 jobs. The experience is there, Uncle Marcus. You just never bothered to ask about it." He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, really seeing me, and what he saw clearly didn't match the narrative he'd constructed. Tristan pushed off from the bookshelf, his casual demeanor replaced with something harder. "So what? Grandpa had some private relationship with you, shared some inside jokes, and now you get everything? This is nepotism dressed up as merit." I turned to face him directly. "No, Tristan. Nepotism is assuming you deserved leadership positions because of your last name. Nepotism is your mother making sure you got introduced to every board member, while my father couldn't get return phone calls. What this is someone who actually earned trust through work instead of proximity." Natalie had her phone out now, not even pretending to be present. She was typing rapidly, probably texting someone, processing her shock the only way she knew how. My mother moved closer to me, not touching, just near, a silent show of support that meant everything. My father's face was complicated, pride mixed with concern mixed with something that looked like vindication for every slight he'd endured over the years. Mr. Pembroke cleared his throat. "If we could move on to the technical details. Jordan, you'll need to meet with the board of directors for each company within the next 2 weeks. I've prepared briefing documents on current operations, financial status, and pending decisions. William also left you a series of video messages, his thoughts on strategic direction for each company. Those are on a secure drive in the safe behind that painting." He gestured to a seascape on the wall that I'd looked at 1,000 times without knowing what it concealed. "What about voting shares?" Victoria asked. Her strategic mind was already working through the math, looking for leverage. "With the remaining 49%, if we vote as a bloc, we can challenge her decisions." Pembroke adjusted his glasses. William anticipated that concern. "The shares are distributed such that no coalition can override Jordan's authority without her agreement." He was quite thorough. "Victoria, you have 15% of Harrison Manufacturing, 8% of Summit Tech, and 12% of Clearwater. Marcus, you have similar distributions. The remainder is divided among other family members, and a small charitable trust Jordan will oversee." "So he's made her a dictator," Marcus said flatly. "One person with absolute control over the family's entire financial future. What could possibly go wrong?" I felt anger rising hot and clean. Not the messy kind that makes you say things you regret, but the focused kind that clarifies everything. I walked over to my grandfather's desk, placed my hands on the smooth wood where his had rested for decades. When I spoke, I looked at each of them in turn. "For 8 years, I've been invisible to you. Not because I wasn't doing anything worth noticing, but because noticing would have complicated your narrative. I was supposed to be the disappointing Blake side of the family, the ones who didn't quite measure up. It was easier to not ask questions, to not see what I was actually accomplishing, because then you could keep feeling superior. Grandpa Bill saw me because he wanted to. He asked questions because he was genuinely curious. He read my work because it mattered to him what I thought. And over years of conversations, he came to trust my judgment more than he trusted the judgment of people who treated him like an ATM with a heartbeat. This isn't about me getting everything. This is about him giving his life's work to someone who actually understood what it meant to him. Victoria's face was ice now, her initial shock crystallizing into cold fury. You have no idea what you're taking on. These companies have complex relationships, political considerations, union negotiations, supplier contracts that go back decades. You can't just walk in with your consulting theories and expect things to work. You're right, I said. I can't do it alone. Which is why I'll be relying on the people who actually know how to run these operations. The plant managers, the account executives, the people who've been doing the real work while everyone was fighting over titles. Uncle Marcus, if you want to stay on as COO, the position is yours. But you'll be there because you're good at operations, not because the job is your birthright. And if you spend your time undermining me, you'll be replaced. His expression flickered, calculation moving behind his eyes. He was weighing his options, pride versus pragmatism. Finally, he gave a tight nod. We'll need to sit down early next week. There are decisions pending that can't wait. Good, I said. Mr. Pembroke, can you send me the briefing documents tonight? I want to be prepared for those meetings. Of course, he replied, and I caught the hint of approval in his voice. William said you'd want to start immediately. He knew you well. Tristan made a disgusted sound and headed for the door. This is insane. I'm calling our attorney. Do that, I said to his back. Mr. Pembroke has already confirmed the will is airtight. But if you want to spend money fighting the inevitable, that's your choice. He paused in the doorway, turned back. You're going to fail. You know that, right? You're going to be in over your head within a month. And when you come asking for help, I'm going to remember this moment. I'm not going to fail, Tristan. But if I do, it'll be my failure to own, not a disaster I can blame on someone else. That's the difference between us. He left without responding. Natalie followed quickly, her heels clicking on the hardwood, already on her phone, probably posting something vague about family betrayals and unexpected changes. Let her. The people who followed her online didn't know anything real about her life anyway. Aunt Victoria gathered her purse with precise movements, each gesture controlled. Arthur, you'll be hearing from our legal team. This isn't over. Mr. Pembroke simply nodded. I expected nothing less, Victoria. But I'd counsel you to consider whether fighting this is worth the family rift it will create. Some things can't be repaired once broken. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something beyond anger. There was fear there, the kind that comes from realizing the world you thought you understood has completely rearranged itself. Your grandfather always had a blind spot for strays, she said quietly. I hope his faith in you wasn't misplaced. Then she was gone, Uncle Marcus trailing behind her, already on his phone making calls. The study felt enormous. Suddenly, just me and my parents and Mr. Pembroke in the space where my grandfather had made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. My father moved first, crossing the room to pull me into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you, he whispered. Always have been, even when no one else noticed. My mother joined us, her arms around both of us. And for a moment I let myself feel the weight of everything that had just happened. 3 companies. Hundreds of employees. A family that would probably never forgive me for being chosen. Mr. Pembroke began packing up his documents, giving us privacy. Jordan, when you're ready, I have those video messages from your grandfather. They're substantial, nearly 4 hours total. He wanted to give you guidance for the first year. I can send them to you securely, or you can watch them here. Here, I said immediately. Can we do it now? He looked surprised. Are you sure? It's been an emotional day. Maybe some distance would be better. No, I said. I need to hear his voice. I need to know what he wanted me to do with this. He nodded slowly, understanding. Let me get the drive. He moved to the seascape painting, swung it aside to reveal a small wall safe. A few moments later, he had a sleek external drive in his hands. I'll set it up on his computer. Your parents are welcome to stay, unless you'd prefer privacy. I looked at my father, then my mother. Stay, I said. Please. Whatever he wanted to tell me, I want you to hear it too. They settled into the leather chairs while Mr. Pembroke connected the drive to my grandfather's desktop computer, the monitor coming to life with a soft glow. There are multiple files here, organized by topic. Harrison Manufacturing, Summit Tech, Clearwater Properties, and one labeled Personal Message. That one's dated from last week. Start with that one, I said, my throat tight. Mr. Pembroke clicked on the file labeled Personal Message and stepped back from the desk. The video player opened, and there was my grandfather sitting in this very chair, the same lamp casting warm light across his face. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp and clear. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 6 days before he died. Jordan, he began, and hearing his voice made my chest ache. If you're watching this, then everything went according to plan, which means Arthur read the letter, and you're probably still processing the shock. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I wanted to, more times than I can count, but I needed you to keep working without the weight of expectation. The moment you knew what was coming, everything would have changed. You'd have second-guessed yourself, or worse, you'd have started performing for an audience instead of just doing the work. He leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled together in that way he had when he was thinking through something complex. I need to tell you why I made this choice, not just what I'm asking you to do with it. Your aunt and uncle, they're not bad people. They're just small people who convinced themselves they were large. Victoria built her entire identity around being the matriarch of a successful family. She needed the Harrison name to mean something because without it, she wasn't sure who she was. Marcus is competent, like I said in the letter, but competence without vision is just maintenance. He could keep the machine running, but he'd never question whether the machine was pointed in the right direction. My grandfather paused, took a sip from a glass of water that sat just off-screen. When I started Harrison Manufacturing 52 years ago, it wasn't about building wealth. I mean, yes, I wanted financial security, but that wasn't the core of it. I wanted to create something that mattered. Jobs that paid well enough for people to buy homes, raise families, send their kids to college. I wanted to prove you could be profitable and ethical at the same time, that you didn't have to choose between shareholder value and worker dignity. For a long time, I think I succeeded at that. But lately, the last decade or so, I've watched the pressure build to compromise those values. Wall Street analysts telling us we need to cut labor costs, move manufacturing overseas, maximize short-term returns. Marcus listened to those voices. He never pushed back hard enough, because he didn't understand why those values mattered in the first place. The camera caught him looking directly at the lens, directly at me, and it felt like he was right there in the room. You understand, Jordan. You always have. That analysis you sent me about Meridian Industries, you didn't just outline how to restructure the company for profitability. You mapped out how to do it while protecting the workers, how to retrain instead of replace, how to build towards sustainable growth instead of quarterly gains. That's when I knew. That's when I started putting this plan together. My mother reached over and took my hand, squeezed it gently. On the screen, my grandfather shifted forward, his expression becoming more serious. Now let me tell you what you're inheriting, really inheriting, not just the corporate structure, but the actual state of things. Harrison Manufacturing is solid but aging. We need to modernize our facilities, invest in new equipment, but we also need to do it in a way that doesn't leave people behind. There's going to be pressure to automate everything, cut the workforce, boost margins. You're going to have board members, investors, people with business degrees and no conscience, telling you that's the only way forward. They're wrong. It's the easy way, not the only way. Summit Tech Solutions is the most valuable of the 3 companies right now, but it's also the most volatile. We acquired it 8 years ago when I saw the writing on the wall. Knew that manufacturing alone wasn't going to sustain us long term. The tech sector moves fast, which means you need to move fast too. I've kept Marcus away from most of the decisions there because his instinct is always to slow down, be cautious, protect what we have. Sometimes you need to risk what you have to get what you need. I think you understand that better than he does. Clearwater Properties is my insurance policy, my hedge against economic turbulence. Real estate, especially the kind we hold, commercial properties in growing markets, tends to maintain value even when other sectors struggle. It's not glamorous, but it's stable income that gives you flexibility with the other companies. You can make bold moves with Harrison and Summit because Clearwater gives you a cushion. Don't let anyone convince you to liquidate those holdings for short-term capital. They're more valuable as stability than as cash. He paused again, and I could see him considering his next words carefully. Here's what I need you to know about leadership, the real kind, not the performance version your cousin has been practicing. Leadership isn't about having the loudest voice in the room, or making sure everyone knows you're in charge. It's about seeing what needs to be done and having the courage to do it even when it's unpopular. You're going to make decisions that upset people. Board members will resign in protest. Family members will stop speaking to you. Business journalists will question your judgment. Some of those critics will be right about specific things. You're going to make mistakes. But if you stay focused on the core values, on building something sustainable instead of something exploitative, the mistakes will be correctable. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching his father on the screen with an intensity I'd rarely seen from him. Grandpa Bill's voice softened slightly. David, I know you're probably there too. I hope Jordan let you stay. I owe you apologies I can never fully deliver, son. I let Victoria run roughshod over you and Patricia for too many years. I told myself I was staying neutral, not taking sides in sibling conflicts, but neutrality in the face of injustice is just cowardice with better PR. You chose a life of meaning over a life of accumulation. And I should have defended that choice more vocally. Teaching is holy work. You've shaped hundreds of young minds, giving kids tools to think critically and challenge assumptions. That matters more than quarterly earnings reports. I hope this decision, giving Jordan this responsibility, helps make up in some small way for the years I failed to stand up for your family. My father's eyes were wet now, his jaw working as he tried to keep his composure. My mother's grip on my hand tightened. On screen, my grandfather turned his attention back to me. Jordan, you're going to face immediate challenges. Within days, probably. Marcus will test you, see if you'll defer to his experience. Victoria will work behind the scenes, calling board members, trying to build opposition. Tristan will probably do something stupid and public, an interview or a social media campaign questioning your qualifications. Let them. Don't respond immediately. Don't defend yourself publicly. Instead, do the work. Meet with the plant managers. Talk to the people on the floor. Review the actual operations, not just the reports that get sent to the executive suite. Build relationships with people who know how things really function. He reached for something off-screen, pulled out a leather notebook that I recognized immediately. It was the one he always carried, filled with his observations and ideas. I'm leaving you 3 years' worth of notes in this. Arthur has the original. Everything I learned, every mistake I made, every piece of wisdom I picked up along the way. Read it cover to cover. Some of it will seem outdated, and some of it is, but the principles underneath remain sound. Treat people with dignity. Pay them fairly. Don't sacrifice long-term stability for short-term gains. Question the conventional wisdom. Remember that every decision you make affects real people with real lives. The video continued for another 20 minutes, my grandfather walking through specific challenges he anticipated for each company. He talked about union negotiations coming up at Harrison Manufacturing, about key personnel I should trust and others I should watch carefully. He discussed emerging competitors in the tech space, regulatory changes that might impact Clearwater properties. It was like having a detailed roadmap for the first year, not telling me exactly what to do but giving me the context to make informed decisions. Near the end, his tone shifted again, became almost conversational. You know what the hardest part of building all this was? Not the financial challenges or the market competition, or even the family politics, though God knows those were exhausting. The hardest part was loneliness. When you're the person making final decisions, you're fundamentally alone. You can have advisors and consultants and people who care about you, but ultimately you have to live with the consequences of your choices. That's isolating in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. So I'm telling you now, build your own council. Find people you trust absolutely, People who will tell you hard truths instead of comfortable lies. Your father is one of those people, though he probably doesn't realize it. He has moral clarity that's rare in this world. Listen to him, especially when he's telling you things you don't want to hear. My grandfather looked directly into the camera, his expression soft. I'm proud of you, Jordan. I have been for years. I'm sorry I didn't say it more clearly, more often, more publicly. I'm sorry I let your accomplishments go uncelebrated while your cousins got praise for doing the bare minimum. That was my failure, not yours. You never needed external validation to keep doing excellent work, and that's part of why you're ready for this. But still, you deserve to hear it. You're brilliant, capable, ethical, and brave. Everything I hoped my legacy would be, you already are. Don't let the weight of this crush you. Don't let the critics make you small. And don't let the family drama distract you from what actually matters, the work itself. The video ended there, my grandfather's face freezing for a moment before the screen went dark. The study was silent except for the sound of my mother quietly crying, my father's hand on her shoulder. Mr. Pembroke stood near the window, giving us space, his professional demeanor momentarily softened. I sat in my grandfather's chair, my hands flat on his desk, trying to absorb everything I'd just heard. 3 companies, hundreds of employees, a family that would fight me, and a dead man's faith that I could handle it all. After a long moment, I looked up at Mr. Pembroke. When do I start? He almost smiled. Technically, you already have. You became the controlling shareholder the moment your grandfather passed. But practically speaking, I'd suggest we schedule meetings with each company's executive team for early next week. Give yourself the weekend to process, review the briefing documents, watch the other video messages. Monday morning, we hit the ground running. My father cleared his throat. Jordan, you don't have to accept this. You know that, right? If it's too much, if you don't want this kind of responsibility, there are ways to structure it differently. You could sell your shares, appoint someone else to run things, step back and live your own life without this weight. I appreciated him saying it, offering me an exit, but we both knew I wasn't going to take it. This isn't about what I want, Dad. It's about what Grandpa built and what it deserves. He trusted me with this. I'm not going to walk away just because it's hard. My mother stood, moved behind the chair, put her hands on my shoulders. Then we'll help you however we can. Your father and I, we don't know much about running companies, but we know about you. We know you'll figure this out because you always do. And when it gets overwhelming, when the loneliness hits like your grandfather warned, you call us. 2 in the morning, doesn't matter. You're not doing this alone. I reached up and covered her hands with mine. Thank you, both of you, for being here, for always seeing me even when everyone else didn't. Mr. Pembroke closed his laptop, began gathering his materials. I'll send those briefing documents within the hour. There's a lot to absorb. Tomorrow, if you're available, I'd like to meet at my office to go over the governance structure, signing authorities, all the administrative pieces that need to be in place. Does 10 in the morning work? I'll be there. He nodded, shook hands with my father, gave my mother a gentle nod. As he reached the door, he paused. Jordan, your grandfather talked about you constantly. Last few years especially. Every time we met, he'd share something you'd written, some analysis you'd sent him. He'd say, "That's my granddaughter," with this pride that was impossible to miss. He believed in you completely. I thought you should know that. Then he was gone, leaving us alone in the study with the weight of everything that had changed. I stood and moved to the window, looking out at the grounds of the Harrison estate. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and gray, the late afternoon light filtering through clouds. Somewhere in the house, I could hear voices, the catering staff cleaning up, distant relatives still processing the funeral. Out here, it was quiet, peaceful almost. My father joined me at the window. What are you thinking? That I wish he was here, I said honestly. That I want to ask him 1,000 questions. That I'm terrified I'm going to disappoint him. You won't, my father said firmly. Not because you'll be perfect, you won't be, nobody is. But because you'll try to honor what he built, and you'll do it with integrity. That's all anyone can ask. We stood there together, 3 people in a room that had been the center of my grandfather's empire. And I let myself feel everything. The grief fresh and sharp. The fear, real and justified. The anger at being invisible for so long. The determination to prove I could handle this. And underneath it all, something unexpected. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore. Didn't have to shrink myself to fit someone else's narrative. My grandfather had given me more than companies. He'd given me permission to be exactly who I was, fully and without apology. My mother moved to the desk, picked up the photo of me and Grandpa at my graduation. He kept this right here where he could see it every day. That means something, Jordan. That means you weren't invisible to him, not ever. I took the photo from her, studied our smiling faces, remembered that day. I'd been so proud to graduate, to have accomplished something significant. But I'd also been aware that for most of my family, it was just another graduation, nothing special. Natalie, had graduated the year before with much more fanfare. But Grandpa had been there, front row. And afterward he'd taken me to dinner, just the two of us. We talked for hours about what I wanted to do with my degree, what kind of impact I wanted to have. He'd listen like every word mattered, because to him they did. I'm going to watch the other videos, I said. All of them tonight. I need to know what he wanted me to understand. My parents exchanged a look. That's a lot to take in one evening, my father said carefully. Maybe pace yourself. I shook my head. No. I need to do this while everything is fresh, while I can still hear his voice from the letter. Tomorrow I'll start dealing with the practical pieces, but tonight I need to just listen to him. My mother kissed my forehead. Then we'll be at home when you're ready. Call us anytime. Promise me. I promise. After they left, I settled into my grandfather's chair, adjusted the monitor, and opened the file labeled Harrison Manufacturing. My grandfather appeared again, this time with documents spread across the desk in front of him. Reading glasses perched on his nose. If you're watching this, you're ready to dive into the details. Let's talk about the heart of everything I built. Harrison Manufacturing employs 347 people across 2 facilities. Every single one of those people matters. Their names, their families, their hopes for the future. That's not sentiment, that's reality. When you make decisions about this company, you're making decisions about their lives. I watched and took notes as he walked through the company's structure, its strengths and vulnerabilities, the key relationships that made everything work. He talked about Walter Chin, the plant manager at the main facility, who'd been with the company for 28 years and knew every machine like it was part of his own body. He mentioned Lisa Rodriguez, the union representative who was tough but fair, someone I should build a relationship with early. He discussed market pressures, cheaper overseas competition, the constant tension between maintaining quality and reducing costs. This is where you're going to face your biggest challenge, he said at one point. People will tell you to cut costs by cutting people. They'll show you spreadsheets that prove you can increase profit margins by 15% if you just reduce headcount and move some operations to countries where labor is cheaper. The math will be sound. The logic will seem irrefutable. And if you follow that advice, you'll destroy everything this company stands for. There are other ways to increase efficiency, better ways. Invest in your people. Train them for new skills. Upgrade equipment so they can be more productive. Build loyalty so your turnover costs drop. Treat them like assets to develop instead of expenses to minimize. The video ran for over an hour, dense with information but never boring because I could hear the passion underneath every word. This wasn't just business to him. It was life's work, relationships built over decades, promises made and kept. When it ended, I immediately opened the Summit Tech Solutions file. This one was shorter but more intense, my grandfather talking faster, clearly excited about the potential he saw in this company. Tech moves at a different speed than manufacturing, he began. What's cutting edge today is obsolete in 18 months. That means you have to be comfortable with constant change, constant adaptation. It also means you can't get too attached to any particular product or service. Your job is to identify where the market is going and get there first, or at least fast enough to matter. I bought Summit Tech because they had something rare, a team that understood both technical excellence and user experience. A lot of tech companies are good at one or the other. Very few nail both. He walked through the company's current projects, the revenue streams that were solid, and the ones that were experimental. He talked about key personnel, the engineers and designers who were essential to keep, the executives who were competent but replaceable. He discussed competition, venture capital firms that were funding startups trying to eat into Summit's market share, regulatory challenges that might impact certain product lines. The breadth of his knowledge was stunning. He'd clearly spent hundreds of hours understanding this company, even though it wasn't his original passion the way manufacturing was. The final video, Clearwater Properties, was the most philosophical. My grandfather sat back in his chair, looking relaxed, almost contemplative. Real estate is funny, he said. People think it's boring, predictable, safe. And compared to tech or manufacturing, maybe it is. But there's something profound about owning physical space, about being part of the infrastructure that allows communities to function. Every office building we own houses businesses that employ people. Every retail space we lease gives entrepreneurs a chance to build something. We're not just collecting rent. We're providing the foundation for other people's dreams. He talked about the portfolio, 12 commercial properties across 3 states, carefully selected for long-term value rather than quick appreciation. He discussed relationships with tenants, some of whom had been with Clearwater for over a decade. How maintaining those relationships meant sometimes accepting lower rent increases in exchange for stability. He explained his philosophy about development. How he'd always chosen to renovate existing structures rather than tear down and rebuild, because preserving character mattered as much as maximizing square footage. The thing about real estate, Jordan, is that it teaches patience. Manufacturing and tech, they move fast, demand quick decisions. But property is long game. You buy something, you hold it, you maintain it, you slowly increase its value through small improvements and good management. In a weird way, that's a useful counterbalance to the other companies. When Summit Tech is burning through your attention with rapid-fire decisions, you can look at Clearwater and remember that not everything has to move at breakneck speed. Some things get better with time and patience. Near the end of this video, my grandfather's tone shifted one final time, becoming almost wistful. I'm 78 years old as I record this. I've built something I'm proud of, not perfect but good, meaningful. I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. I waited too long to modernize some equipment at Harrison. I passed on acquisition opportunities that would have been smart. I let family politics interfere with business decisions more than I should have. But the core of it, the fundamental belief that business should serve people rather than the other way around, I got that right. And now I'm passing it to you, trusting that you'll carry that forward in your own way. He leaned toward the camera, his expression serious but warm. You're going to be tested, Jordan. There will be moments when doing the right thing costs you money, when treating people with dignity hurts short-term profits, when standing by your principles makes you look foolish to people who measure everything in quarterly returns. In those moments, remember why this matters. Remember that behind every employee number is a person trying to build a life. Remember that leadership is service, not power. And remember that I chose you not despite your values, but because of them. Don't let anyone convince you to become someone you're not. The world has plenty of ruthless CEOs. It needs more ethical ones. The video ended with him simply saying, "I love you, kiddo. Make me proud." Then the screen went dark and I sat in the silence of his study, tears running down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. It was past midnight now. The house had gone quiet. Everyone departed except probably some cleaning crew working in the distant parts of the estate. I was alone with 4 hours of my grandfather's voice still echoing in my head. Alone with the weight of 3 companies and all the lives connected to them. Alone with the knowledge that starting Monday morning, I would be responsible for decisions that mattered in ways I was only beginning to understand. I opened the briefing documents Mr. Pembroke had sent, thick PDFs full of financial statements, organizational charts, market analyses, pending decisions that needed attention. Harrison Manufacturing needed to decide on an equipment modernization plan that would cost $8 million. Summit Tech had a product launch scheduled in 6 weeks that was behind timeline and over budget. Clearwater Properties had a tenant threatening to break their lease over maintenance issues that had been ignored for months. Each problem had multiple solutions, and each solution had consequences that rippled out in directions I'd need to map carefully. I spent the next 3 hours reading, absorbing, making preliminary notes. Not decisions yet, just observations, questions I needed to ask, people I needed to talk to before forming opinions. My grandfather had been right about one thing especially. I couldn't do this from the executive suite, couldn't rely solely on reports filtered through layers of management. I needed to see the operations firsthand, talk to the people actually doing the work, understand the reality underneath the spreadsheets. That meant factory visits, walking the floor at Harrison Manufacturing. That meant sitting with the development teams at Summit Tech, understanding their challenges beyond the sanitized version that made it into status reports. That meant touring the Clearwater properties, meeting tenants, hearing directly what was working and what wasn't. Around 3 a.m, I finally closed my laptop and let myself just sit in my grandfather's chair, looking around the study that had been his command center for decades. The bookshelves held his intellectual history, economics texts from the 70s, business biographies, philosophy, history, even some fiction mixed in. On the wall opposite his desk hung his framed college diploma, his first business license. A photo of him breaking ground on the original Harrison manufacturing facility in 1973. This room told the story of a life built with intention, choices made and followed through, success measured not just in wealth but in impact. My phone buzzed, startling me. A text from my father. Can't sleep. Want to talk? I called him immediately. Hey Dad. Hey sweetheart. Your mom finally dozed off, but I've been lying here thinking about everything that happened today. How are you holding up? I'm okay, I said. Overwhelmed but okay. I just finished watching all his videos. 4 hours of him talking me through everything. It was like having him here, almost. What did he say? I summarized the key points, the values he emphasized, the specific challenges he'd warned me about, the faith he'd expressed in my ability to handle it all. My father listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He saw you, Jordan. Really saw you. That's a rare gift, being truly seen by someone who matters. I know, I said, my voice thick. I just wish I'd told him more directly how much it meant. How much he meant. He knew, my father said firmly. Trust me, he knew. The time he spent preparing those videos, making sure you'd have guidance, that was love. Not the easy kind that just says nice things, but the hard kind that actually helps. We talked for another 20 minutes, not about business but about my grandfather as a person, memories my father had from growing up. Stories I'd never heard before. Like how Grandpa had paid for a neighbor kid's college tuition anonymously when he learned the family couldn't afford it. How he'd kept the Harrison manufacturing plant running during the recession in 2008, even though it cost him personally, because he couldn't stomach laying people off right before the holidays. How he'd quietly funded a scholarship program at the local community college for children of manufacturing workers, never putting his name on it, just wanting to create opportunities. Your grandfather believed wealth was responsibility, not reward, my father said. He thought having money meant you had an obligation to do something meaningful with it. That's not how Victoria sees it, or Marcus or your cousins. They think wealth is proof they're special, that they deserve deference and luxury. But you're more like him. You understand that privilege comes with duty. That's why he trusted you with this. When we finally hung up, the sky outside was starting to lighten. That pre-dawn gray that's neither night nor day. I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. Instead, I walked through the house, really looked at it for maybe the first time. The Harrison estate had always been impressive but intimidating. A place where I felt like a visitor rather than family. Now walking through its rooms, I saw it differently. Not as a monument to wealth, but as evidence of choices made over decades. The art on the walls, my grandfather had told me once, came mostly from local artists he'd commissioned. The furniture was expensive but built to last, many pieces older than I was. The library held first editions but also well-worn paperbacks, books that had been read rather than displayed. Even the kitchen, massive and professional grade, showed signs of actual use, cookbooks with stained pages, a collection of coffee mugs from different places he'd traveled. This wasn't a showplace. It was a home where someone had lived a full life. And now that someone was gone, leaving behind this physical space and the much larger space his absence created, I found myself in the conservatory, a glass-walled room at the back of the house that overlooked the gardens. My grandmother had loved this room before she died, 15 years ago now. She'd grown orchids here, dozens of them, tending them with careful attention. After she passed, my grandfather had kept them going for a while, but eventually, they died off, and he'd never replaced them. Now the conservatory held just a few sturdy ferns and some comfortable furniture, where he'd apparently like to sit in the mornings with his coffee. I could picture him there, reading the newspaper, making notes in his leather journal, thinking through whatever challenges he was facing. The sun was fully up now, weak autumn light filtering through the glass. My phone rang, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me. "Jordan Blake," I said. "Ms. Blake, this is Walter Chin, plant manager at Harrison Manufacturing. I hope I'm not calling too early. Arthur Pembroke gave me your number, said it would be okay to reach out." "Of course," I said, remembering my grandfather's video, his emphasis on building relationships with key people. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause, and I could hear machinery in the background, the sounds of a factory coming to life. "I wanted to call before the word gets out through official channels. I know about your grandfather's will, about you taking over. Arthur gave me a heads up last night. I just wanted to say, well, Bill talked about you a lot. Last few years especially. He respected your mind. Said you understood things most people miss. That means a lot, Mr. Chin. Thank you. Call me Walter. Listen, I know this is going to be complicated, family politics and all that. But from where I sit, down here on the floor with the machines and the people, I think Bill made the right choice. We need someone who's going to think long-term, who's going to see us as people instead of line items." I felt something tight in my chest loosen slightly. "I want to come visit the plant this week," I said. "Not a formal inspection, just a chance to walk around, meet people, understand how things actually work. Would that be okay?" "More than okay," Walter said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "How about Wednesday? I can show you around myself, introduce you to the shift supervisors, answer any questions you have. Wednesday works perfectly. And Walter, thank you for calling. It means more than you know. We're all grieving Bill," he said quietly. "He was a good man, a good boss. We want to honor what he built. I think you're going to help us do that." After we hung up, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, the sense of being overwhelmed, but underneath it was something steadier. Purpose maybe, or just recognition that I wasn't doing this alone. There were people like Walter who wanted this to work, who'd support me if I proved I was worth supporting. That was its own kind of power, different from the controlling shares or the legal authority, more real because it had to be earned rather than inherited. I spent the rest of Sunday at the estate, going through more documents, watching some of my grandfather's videos again to catch details I'd missed the first time, making lists of questions and priorities. Around noon, the house staff brought me lunch, and I realized I'd been working for 9 hours straight without eating. The cook, an older woman named Margaret who'd been with my grandfather for 20 years, lingered in the doorway. "I'm glad it's you," she said quietly. "Mr. Harrison, he always spoke kindly of you. Said you had his head for numbers and your grandmother's heart. I'll miss him terribly." "Me too," I said. "Margaret, did he seem, at the end, was he in pain?" She shook her head. "Tired, yes. But not in pain. And he seemed peaceful, like he'd made his peace with everything. Those last few weeks, he spent a lot of time in this study, recording things on that computer. He'd come out sometimes looking exhausted but satisfied, like he'd finished something important. I think knowing he had a plan, knowing you'd be taking over, that gave him comfort." I thanked her, my throat tight again, grief coming in waves when I least expected it. After she left, I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, my mind already moving forward to Monday, to the first real steps of whatever this was becoming. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. I'd gone home late Sunday, slept restlessly, and woken at 5 with my mind already racing. I dressed carefully, professional but not trying too hard, navy suit and simple jewelry, wanting to project competence without arrogance. At 9:45, I arrived at Arthur Pembroke's office, a suite in a restored brownstone in downtown Hartford. All dark wood and leather furniture that suggested old money and discretion. He greeted me warmly, ushered me into a conference room where documents were already laid out in organized stacks. We spent 3 hours going through administrative necessities. signing authorities for bank accounts, access credentials for company systems, insurance documents, legal authorizations. It was tedious but necessary, each signature making the transfer of power more real, more official. Arthur walked me through everything patiently, explaining implications, answering my questions, occasionally offering strategic advice when something went beyond pure administration. Around 1, his assistant brought in sandwiches, and we kept working through lunch. Your grandfather wanted to make this as smooth as possible, Arthur said at one point. He spent months working with our firm to structure everything properly, anticipating challenges, closing loopholes. Victoria is going to look for ways to contest this, and she won't find any. Marcus might try to undermine you operationally, make you look incompetent so the board loses confidence. That's a harder thing to protect against legally. You'll have to prove yourself there. I intend to, I said. That's why I'm visiting the Harrison plant Wednesday. Why I've scheduled meetings with key people at Summit and Clearwater this week. I need to understand these operations from the inside, not just from reports. Arthur nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. Your grandfather said you'd know that instinctively. He also said, and I'm quoting directly here, Jordan doesn't need me to tell her how to do this. She needs me to clear the path so she can do it her way. So that's what I've tried to set up. Clear path, minimal interference, support when you need it. If you run into legal challenges or contractual issues, call me immediately. If family members try to create problems, document everything. I've dealt with Victoria and Marcus for 30 years. I know their tactics. Thank you, Arthur. For everything. For helping him prepare this, for believing in it. He smiled slightly. I didn't just believe in it because William asked me to. I believe in it because I've read your work. Bill used to forward me your analyses sometimes, get my thoughts on legal implications. You're exceptionally good at what you do, Jordan. You see patterns others miss. These companies are lucky to have you, whether they realize it yet or not. By the time I left his office, I had a briefcase full of documents, passwords for a dozen different systems, and a clear understanding of my legal standing. I drove back to my apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Hartford that suddenly felt very small compared to the Harrison estate, compared to the magnitude of what I was stepping into. My roommate, Elena, was home, working remotely from the kitchen table. She looked up when I came in. You look exhausted, she said. Everything okay? I dropped my briefcase on the counter, collapsed onto the couch. My grandfather died. His funeral was yesterday. I'm now the majority owner of 3 companies, and half my family wants me to fail. Elena stared at me. What? I knew your grandfather passed, you told me that, but the companies, what? I explained, watching her expression shift from confusion to shock to something like awe. Holy shit, Jordan. I don't even know what that is. Overwhelming? Terrifying? The best gift anyone's ever given you? All of that, I said. Simultaneously. She got up, came and sat next to me. What do you need? How can I help? Honestly, just be normal, I said. Everyone else is going to treat me differently now. My family already looks at me like I'm either a threat or an imposter. I need at least one person to just be the same. She squeezed my hand. I can do that. Same Elena who reminds you to eat and tells you when you're overthinking things. Thanks. I leaned back, closed my eyes. Elena, am I insane for thinking I can do this? Are you insane for thinking you can run multiple companies at 30? Yeah, probably. But you're also the person who rebuilt that consulting firm's entire risk assessment model in 3 months, when everyone said it couldn't be done. You're the person who works 16-hour days and still finds time to explain complex financial concepts to me in ways I can understand. If your grandfather trusted you with this, he probably had good reasons. I hope you're right, I said. Because Wednesday I'm walking into a manufacturing plant where half the people probably think I'm a kid playing dress-up. And I need to somehow convince them I deserve to be there. Elena stood, headed to the kitchen. Then you'll do what you always do. You'll outwork everyone, outthink everyone, and you'll prove it through results instead of arguments. Now, are you hungry? Because you look like you haven't eaten anything substantial in days. She was right, of course. I'd been running on coffee and adrenaline. She made pasta while I showered and changed, And we ate together while I told her more details about the funeral, about Aunt Victoria's face when the letter was read, about Tristan's barely contained rage, about my father's quiet pride. It felt good to process it verbally, to have someone listen without judgment or agenda. Tuesday I spent preparing for Wednesday's plant visit, researching the equipment modernization proposal my grandfather had mentioned, studying labor statistics and industry trends, making sure I understood the context before I walked in. I also had a video call with Catherine Wells, my grandfather's business associate who apparently knew more about Summit Tech than anyone. She was in her mid-50s, sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, zooming in from Summit's office in Boston. "Jordan," she said without preamble, "Bill told me you'd be taking over. I want you to know I support this decision completely, but I also want to be clear about what you're walking into at Summit." "Tell me everything," I said. She spent 90 minutes doing exactly that, walking through internal politics, technical challenges, market pressures, personnel issues that weren't in any official report. She was frank about the company's weaknesses, equally clear about its strengths. At the end, she said something that stuck with me. "Your grandfather bought this company because he saw potential everyone else missed. The same way he saw potential in you when everyone else was looking elsewhere. Don't try to run this like a manufacturing company. Tech requires different instincts, faster pivots, more tolerance for failure. If you can learn to think at tech speed while maintaining your strategic discipline, Summit could be extraordinary." "I'll do my best," I said. "Catherine, can I count on you for advice as I figure this out?" "Absolutely. Bill asked me to look out for you and I would. Have anyway. Call anytime. I have one request though." "What's that?" "Don't let Marcus slow you down. He's going to want committee meetings and 3 months of analysis before any decision. Sometimes you need to move fast and accept some risk." Bill understood that. "Make sure you do too." "Understood," I said, filing that advice away with everything else I was learning. Wednesday morning I drove to Harrison Manufacturing, a facility in the industrial section of Ashford Hills that I'd driven past hundreds of times without really seeing. The building was older but well-maintained, brown brick with Harrison Manufacturing in faded letters across the front. I parked in a visitor spot and sat for a moment, gathering myself. Through the windows, I could see the factory floor, people moving with purpose, machines running. The actual work my grandfather had spent his life building happening right there. I thought about his words from the video. Every single one of those people matters. Their names, their families, their hopes for the future. That's not sentiment, that's reality. Walter Chin met me at the entrance. A compact man in his 60s with weathered hands and kind eyes. "Ms. Blake, welcome. Please call me Jordan." "Okay, Jordan. Let me show you around." We spent 4 hours walking every section of the plant. Walter introduced me to shift supervisors, machine operators, quality control specialists, maintenance crew. He explained the manufacturing process in detail, showed me where the workflow was efficient, and where it created bottlenecks, talked about equipment that was running well and machinery that needed replacing. He didn't simplify things or talk down to me, just gave me information and let me process it. What struck me most was how people responded when Walter introduced me. There was curiosity, sure, and some skepticism, but also something like hope. These were people who'd heard that change was coming, who knew my grandfather had died and someone new was taking over, and they were cautiously optimistic that maybe, just maybe, things wouldn't get worse. I asked questions, lots of them, about safety protocols and production targets and maintenance schedules. I asked about union relations, about turnover rates, about what people liked about working there, and what frustrated them. One of the machine operators, a woman named Carol who'd been there 16 years, pulled me aside at one point. "Your grandfather visited this floor every month," she said. "Talked to people by name, remembered details about our families. Most owners never step foot in here. They just look at spreadsheets and make decisions that affect our lives without knowing anything about us. I hope you'll be different." "I'll be here," I said. "Not every month maybe, but regularly. And I'll listen, really listen, because I can't make good decisions without understanding what's actually happening." She nodded slowly. "That's what we need. Someone who listens." By the time I left the plant, I had pages of notes, dozens of photos on my phone, and a much clearer picture of what the $8 million modernization proposal actually meant. It wasn't just about efficiency or profit margins. It was about safety, about reducing injuries from outdated equipment. It was about sustainability, about reducing waste and energy consumption. It was about staying competitive so these jobs still existed in 5 years. The math would matter, the return on investment calculations, but the human factors mattered more. That was the lesson my grandfather had been trying to teach through all those videos. Numbers matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. Thursday and Friday I visited Summit Tech and toured Clearwater properties, each visit giving me more context, more relationships, more understanding of what I'd inherited. By Friday evening, I was exhausted but energized, overwhelmed but clear. I knew what I was doing now, not all of it, not even most of it, but enough to start. Enough to make the first real decisions. Saturday morning, I received an email from Uncle Marcus requesting a meeting. His tone was formal, carefully neutral, but I could read the subtext. He wanted to establish his role, make sure I understood he was still important, still influential. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Hartford, neutral territory. He arrived precisely on time, ordered black coffee, got straight to business. "Jordan, I want to be clear about something. I may not agree with your grandfather's decision, but I respect it. I've spent 20 years at Harrison Manufacturing. I know that company inside and out. If you're smart, you'll lean on that experience instead of trying to reinvent everything. I appreciate that, Uncle Marcus. And I do plan to lean on your expertise where it's relevant. But I also need to make my own assessments, build my own understanding. I've spent this week visiting all 3 companies, talking to people, seeing operations firsthand. I'm not going to make changes just to prove I'm in charge, but I'm also not going to maintain status quo just to avoid conflict." His jaw tightened slightly. "That equipment modernization proposal, it's too expensive right now. We should wait, see how next quarter's numbers look before committing that kind of capital." "I disagree," I said calmly. "I've reviewed the proposal, talked to Walter and his team, looked at the injury rates from current equipment. Waiting costs us more in the long run, both financially and in human terms. We're moving forward with it." "You don't have the full picture," he said, an edge in his voice now. "There are other factors, market conditions, credit arrangements, things you don't understand yet." "Then explain them to me," I said. "Show me the factors I'm missing. If there are legitimate reasons to delay, I want to know what they are. But if this is just risk aversion or protecting cash reserves for some other purpose, then no, we're not waiting." We talked for another hour. Tension simmering but never quite boiling over. By the end, we'd reached an uneasy understanding. He would keep his position, continue managing day-to-day operations, but strategic decisions went through me. If he disagreed, he could make his case, but ultimately I had final say. He didn't like it, that was clear, but he also knew fighting it openly would only diminish his position further. As we stood to leave, he said quietly, "Your grandfather was sentimental about people. Sometimes that sentimentality clouded his judgment. Don't make the same mistake." "My grandfather was strategic about people," I corrected. "He understood that taking care of employees built loyalty, reduced turnover, created stability. That's not sentiment. That's smart business." "We'll see," Marcus said and walked away. The following Monday, 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, I called my first board meeting for Harrison Manufacturing. The conference room was tense, board members uncertain about this young woman who'd suddenly appeared as majority owner. Some openly skeptical, others cautiously reserved. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I presented the modernization proposal, backed with data I'd gathered personally from the plant visit, from Walter's detailed reports, from industry research. I showed injury statistics, productivity projections, long-term cost savings. I addressed every concern methodically, and when a board member suggested we table the decision for further study, I said simply no. We're voting today. The motion passed, barely, with my controlling shares making the difference. After the meeting, one of the older board members, a man who'd known my grandfather for decades, approached me. "That was well done," he said. "You didn't just rely on your voting power. You made the case on merits. Bill would have appreciated that." "Thank you," I said. I'm trying to honor what he built while also moving it forward. That's the balance, isn't it? The old man smiled. That's exactly the balance. And it's harder than it looks. You'll make mistakes. We all do. The question is whether you learn from them or defend them. I intend to learn, I said. And I intend to listen to people who have wisdom to share. Over the following months, I settled into rhythms and routines. Weekly visits to one of the 3 companies, rotating so I maintained regular presence everywhere. Monthly meetings with key personnel. Constant communication with legal, financial, and operational teams. I made decisions, some popular, many not. I approved the modernization at Harrison and absorbed the financial hit to quarterly profits. I greenlit a risky product pivot at Summit Tech that half the executive team opposed. I invested in renovating the Clearwater properties rather than raising rents, prioritizing tenant relationships over immediate income. Some decisions worked out better than I'd hoped. The modernization reduced injuries by 40% in the first 6 months. The Summit Tech pivot captured market share from a competitor who'd gotten complacent. The Clearwater renovations led to every tenant renewing their leases, something that hadn't happened in years. Other decisions taught me expensive lessons. I trusted the wrong person on a hiring decision at Summit and had to terminate them 4 months later. I moved too slowly on addressing a quality control issue at Harrison that cost us a major client. I made mistakes, sometimes painful ones, but I learned from each one, adjusted, got better. My relationship with most of my family never recovered, not really. Aunt Victoria stopped speaking to me entirely after her legal challenge failed. Tristan badmouthed me on social media for a while until his own career imploded, and he had bigger problems. Natalie occasionally reached out, usually when she wanted something, and I kept those interactions cordial but distant. Uncle Marcus and I developed a functional working relationship, never warm but professionally effective. He learned I'd listen to his expertise if he presented it respectfully, and I learned when his caution was wisdom versus when it was fear. But my parents and I grew closer. My father became an informal advisor, someone I could call when ethical dilemmas got complicated, when I needed to think through the human impact of business decisions. My mother became my anchor, the person who reminded me to eat and sleep, and occasionally step back from the endless demands. And Elena, my roommate turned closest friend, kept me grounded in the real world beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. A year after my grandfather's funeral, I stood in his study, now my study, looking at the same view he'd looked at for decades. The companies were stable, growing, evolving. Harrison Manufacturing had launched a sustainability initiative that was attracting attention from other firms. Summit Tech had released its most successful product in 5 years. Clearwater Properties was expanding into a 4th state. I'd made hundreds of decisions, built dozens of relationships, proven to skeptics that my grandfather's faith wasn't misplaced. But more than that, I'd learned what he'd tried to teach me through those videos and through his example. That leadership is service. That people matter more than profit margins, not because it's noble but because it's practical. That building something sustainable requires patience, integrity, and the courage to make unpopular choices. That being invisible sometimes means people underestimate you. And that can become power if you use it wisely. I thought about that funeral, about sitting in the back row while my family whispered about his empire. About the letter that changed everything, the moment recognition replaced invisibility. About walking into that first board meeting terrified but determined, and walking out knowing I could do this. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough. Honestly enough. With enough integrity that when my time came to pass these companies to someone else, I'd be able to say I honored what he built, protected what mattered, and maybe made it a little better. My phone rang, pulling me from reflection. It was Walter Chin with a question about next week's production schedule. I answered, discussed the issue, made a decision, and moved on to the next thing. Because that's what this was now. Not a dramatic moment or a shocking reversal. Just work, meaningful work, the kind my grandfather had spent his life doing. And finally, after years of being invisible to the people who should have seen me, I was doing it too. Not for recognition or validation, but because it mattered. Because 347 people at Harrison Manufacturing deserved someone who cared about more than spreadsheets. Because doing hard things well is its own reward. My grandfather had given me more than companies. He'd given me purpose, responsibility, and the example of what it looks like to build something that outlasts you. I was going to honor that gift by doing the work, making hard choices, staying true to values even when they cost me. Not because it would make me rich or famous, or even particularly happy, but because it was right. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. 5 years had passed since the funeral that changed everything. I stood in the conference room on the top floor of the new Harrison Manufacturing headquarters, a building that hadn't existed when my grandfather died, looking out over Ashford Hills as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the landscape. The view reminded me of his study at the estate, that same quality of light, that same sense of surveying something built with intention and care. Behind me, the room was filling with people for what had become an annual tradition, a gathering I'd started 3 years ago to mark the anniversary of his passing. Walterchen arrived first, as he always did, now officially retired but still consulting part-time because he couldn't quite let go of the plant he'd helped build. He looked older, moved a little slower, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Jordan," he said, gripping my hand firmly. "Good turnout this year." "More people every time," I replied. "I think word is spreading about what we're actually doing here." He smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud. Not just of the numbers, though those are impressive, of the culture you've maintained. That was always what mattered most to him." Catherine Wells flew in from Boston, Summit Tech's president now, a promotion I'd given her 2 years ago when it became clear she understood the company better than anyone else. She'd transformed it from a promising acquisition into an industry leader, and she'd done it while maintaining the balance my grandfather had valued: innovation without exploitation, growth without recklessness. We hugged briefly, the kind of embrace that comes from years of working together through challenges that tested both of us. "Revenue projections look good for next quarter," she said. "The new platform is exceeding expectations." "We'll discuss it Monday," I said. "Today is about remembering why we do any of this." Lisa Rodriguez, the union representative from Harrison Manufacturing, came next. We'd butted heads more than once over the years, but we'd also built something rare, a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine dialogue. She didn't always agree with my decisions, and I didn't always agree with her demands, but we'd learned to find solutions that honored both business realities and worker needs. Negotiations weren't battles anymore. They were conversations. "Jordan," she said, "I brought something for you." She handed me a framed photo, a candid shot someone had taken during last year's plant anniversary celebration. In it, I was on the factory floor, surrounded by workers, all of us laughing at something, the kind of genuine moment you can't stage. I felt my throat tighten. "This is beautiful, Lisa." "Thank you. You earned it," she said simply. 5 years ago, a lot of people were scared about what would happen when Bill died. Would the new owner gut the place, ship jobs overseas, squeeze every penny out while destroying what made this company special? You proved them wrong. You proved a lot of people wrong. I'm still proving them wrong, I said with a slight smile. Some people are still waiting for me to fail. "Let them wait," she said. "You're doing fine." My father and mother arrived together, both of them looking healthier and happier than they had in years. My father had retired from teaching the previous spring, and the reduced stress had taken years off both of them. They'd traveled some, spent time with friends, rediscovered parts of themselves that had been buried under decades of financial stress and family dismissal. My father had also become more involved with Harrison Manufacturing's education initiatives, programs I'd created to provide training and advancement opportunities for workers and their families. He'd found a way to bring his teaching expertise into the business world, and watching him thrive in that role brought me more satisfaction than any quarterly earnings report ever could. "Sweetheart," my mother said, hugging me tightly, "the place looks wonderful. You've done so much with it." "We've done so much with it," I corrected. "I couldn't have built any of this without your support. Without both of you reminding me who I am when the pressure gets overwhelming." My father squeezed my shoulder. "Your grandfather would be so proud, Jordan. Not just of the business success, but of how you've handled it. You've stayed true to yourself, to your values. That's harder than it sounds. The room continued to fill. Plant managers from both Harrison facilities, the original one and the new expansion we'd opened in a neighboring state. Key engineers from Summit Tech who'd been with us through multiple product cycles. Property managers from Clearwater's growing portfolio. And sprinkled among them, people who represented my grandfather's true legacy, scholarship recipients from the program I'd expanded and renamed in his honor. Former employees whose medical bills we'd helped cover when they faced health crises. Family members of workers who'd benefited from the childcare center we'd built at the main plant. I noticed someone standing near the door, hesitant, and my breath caught. It was Tristan, my cousin, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed too formal for him now. We hadn't spoken in over 3 years, not since his social media campaign against me had backfired spectacularly when journalists actually investigated and found I was doing exactly what I'd claimed, running the companies with integrity and success. He'd slunk away after that, his credibility damaged, his own career stalling out. I hadn't gloated. I'd simply moved on, focused on the work rather than the drama. He saw me notice him and started to turn away, but I crossed the room quickly. Tristan, I said. He turned back, surprised. Jordan. I wasn't sure if I should come. I'm glad you did, I said, and meant it. This is about family, about remembering Grandpa Bill. Whatever happened between us, he loved you. You belonged here. His eyes were wet. I was an ass. A complete ass. I was jealous and angry, and I said things that weren't true. Things that could have hurt what you were building. I know, I said. But you're here now. That means something. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. Years of resentment and rivalry hanging between us. Then he said quietly, I've been following the company news. What you've done, it's remarkable. Grandpa made the right choice. I didn't want to believe it at the time, but he did. Thank you, I said. That couldn't have been easy to say. He shrugged. Growth is supposed to be uncomfortable, right? I'm trying to learn that. Come in, I said. Find a seat. There's someone I want you to meet later. One of the scholarship recipients is studying business at the same school you went to. Maybe you could mentor him, share some of what you learned. His face showed surprise, then something like gratitude. I'd like that. Thanks, Jordan. I watched him move into the room, finding a seat in the back, still uncertain but present. That was enough. Reconciliation doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in small moments, invitations extended, olive branches offered, the choice to see people as capable of change rather than frozen in their worst moments. The program started simply. I stood at the front of the room, looking at the faces gathered there. People whose lives intersected with my grandfather's legacy in countless ways. Thank you all for coming, I began. 5 years ago today, we said goodbye to William Harrison. For those of you who knew him, you know he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes both in business and in life. But he also built something meaningful, something that outlasted him. And he did it with values that are increasingly rare in corporate America. He believed business should serve people, not the other way around. He believed wealth came with responsibility. And he believed that doing the right thing, even when it cost you in the short term, paid dividends in ways that couldn't always be measured in dollars. I paused, gathering my thoughts. When I inherited these companies, a lot of people doubted I could handle it. I was too young, too inexperienced, too idealistic. Some of those critics were family members who should have known better. Some were industry analysts who judged me before I'd made a single decision. And honestly, some days I doubted myself too. The weight of 3 companies, hundreds of employees, families depending on the choices I made, it was overwhelming. But I had advantages those critics didn't see. I had my grandfather's example. I had his video messages giving me guidance. I had people like Walter and Catherine and Lisa, who were willing to give me a chance, to teach me what I needed to know, to call me out when I was wrong. And I had the knowledge that what we were building mattered, truly mattered, in ways that went beyond profit margins. I looked around the room. These last 5 years haven't been easy. We've faced economic downturns, supply chain crises, competitive pressures, internal challenges. We've made tough decisions, some that cost us money in the short term, but positioned us better for the long term. We modernized Harrison manufacturing, and yes, it hurt that first year financially, But now we're more efficient, safer, and more competitive than we've been in decades. We took risks at Summit Tech, pivoted when conventional wisdom said to stay the course, and those gambles have paid off beyond what anyone projected. We invested in people and properties at Clearwater when others were cutting costs, and now we have tenant loyalty that money can't buy. None of this was guaranteed. All of it required faith that doing things right would eventually lead to doing things successfully. Catherine spoke next, sharing stories about working with my grandfather, how he'd pushed her to think bigger while staying grounded, how he'd balanced ambition with ethics in ways she'd tried to emulate. Walter followed, talking about the plant floor culture, how workers felt valued rather than expendable, how that translated into lower turnover, better quality, stronger performance. Lisa discussed the union partnership we'd built, how rare it was to have management that genuinely listened instead of just negotiating, how that had created stability that benefited everyone. Each speaker reinforced the same theme. This wasn't just business. This was community, purpose, legacy. Then came the part that mattered most to me. We called up 6 scholarship recipients, young people from families connected to our companies who were now in college or trade schools, pursuing dreams that might not have been possible without financial support. They each spoke briefly about what the opportunity meant, how it had changed their trajectory, how they hoped to give back someday. One young woman, daughter of a Harrison manufacturing machinist, was studying engineering. She talked about visiting the plant as a child, watching her father work, and wanting to design better systems, safer processes, more sustainable approaches. She'd be interning with us next summer, the first step in what I hoped would be a long career building on what her father and grandfather had helped create. Another recipient, a young man whose mother worked in property management at Clearwater, was studying business administration with a focus on ethical leadership. He spoke about seeing his mother stressed about balancing tenant needs against owner demands, about how our approach of prioritizing relationships over maximum extraction had shown him there was a different way to do business. He wanted to bring that philosophy to whatever industry he eventually entered, prove that ethical business wasn't an oxymoron. Listening to them, I felt something shift inside me, that same feeling I'd had watching my grandfather's videos, understanding that this was the point. Not the wealth, not the power, not even the business success, but the ripple effects, the lives touched, the possibilities created, the proof that capitalism didn't have to be predatory to be profitable. After the formal program ended, people mingled, sharing food and memories, laughter mixing with occasional tears as stories about my grandfather circulated. I found myself in a corner with my father, both of us watching the crowd. This is what he wanted, my father said quietly. Not the buildings or the bank accounts, but this. People coming together, supporting each other, building something bigger than themselves. I know, I said. And I'm trying to preserve that. Sometimes I worry I'm not doing enough, that I'm letting the business pressures compromise the values. You're doing fine, he said firmly. You're doing better than fine. You've grown these companies while maintaining what made them special. That's incredibly hard, Jordan. Most people can't pull that off. The fact that you're worried about it proves you're the right person for this job. Elena found me later, my roommate who was no longer my roommate since I'd finally moved to a house of my own the previous year, but who remained my closest friend. She'd brought her new girlfriend, a doctor she'd been seeing for 6 months, someone I genuinely liked and hoped would stick around. So this is what corporate events look like when the CEO isn't a sociopath, her girlfriend joked. Pretty revolutionary. We try, I said with a smile. Though I'm sure there are people who think I'm too soft, too focused on the touchy-feely stuff instead of pure profit maximization. Those people are idiots, Elena said flatly. Your profit margins are excellent, your employee retention is industry-leading, and you sleep at night. That's not soft. That's smart. I'd argue, but you're not wrong, I admitted. As the evening wound down and people started departing, I found myself alone in the conference room for a few minutes, looking out at the darkening sky. My phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Marcus. Simple, just 2 words. Well done. We'd reached an understanding over the years, not warmth exactly, but professional respect. He'd learned I would listen to his expertise when it was offered constructively, and I'd learned that his caution sometimes prevented costly mistakes. He'd never be my ally, Probably never truly forgive me for inheriting what he'd assumed would be his, but we'd found a way to work together that served the company. That was enough. Another text came through, this one from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading. Then curiosity got the better of me. It was from Natalie. I know we haven't talked in years, and that's on me. I just wanted to say I saw the article about the expansion and the scholarship program. Grandpa would be really proud. You were always smarter than the rest of us, and I was too insecure to admit it. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling complicated things. Anger at years of dismissal. Satisfaction at the acknowledgement. Weariness at the emotional labor of family reconciliation. But also something softer, recognition that people could grow, that apologies mattered even when they came late. I typed back. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you might think. Maybe we could get coffee sometime. If you want. Her response came quickly. I'd like that. I put my phone away and returned to the window, letting myself feel the full weight of 5 years. 5 years of decisions, some brilliant, many adequate, a few genuinely terrible. 5 years of learning to trust my instincts while staying open to advice. 5 years of proving that my grandfather's faith wasn't misplaced, that I could carry this forward without losing what made it meaningful. The companies were stronger now. Harrison Manufacturing had expanded, added a second facility, pioneered new sustainability practices that were becoming industry standards. Summit Tech had gone from promising to dominant. Our platforms running systems that millions of people use daily. Clearwater Properties had grown strategically, each acquisition chosen for long-term value rather than quick returns. But more than the metrics, more than the revenue growth or market share gains, what mattered was the culture we'd preserved. Workers at Harrison still felt valued, still believed their labor contributed to something worthwhile. Engineers at Summit still felt empowered to take creative risks, still believed innovation could coexist with ethics. Tenants at Clearwater still felt heard, still believed their landlord cared about their success. That culture, fragile and precious, was my grandfather's true legacy, and protecting it while growing the business had been the hardest, most rewarding work of my life. I thought about that funeral 5 years ago, sitting in the back row, invisible to everyone except the man who'd seen me all along. I thought about the letter, the shocked faces, the moment everything shifted. I thought about those first terrifying weeks, walking into rooms where people doubted me, questioned me, waited for me to fail. And I thought about the slow, steady work of proving them wrong, not through words but through actions, decisions backed by data and guided by values, consistent performance that built trust over time. My grandfather had given me an impossible gift. Not just wealth or opportunity, but responsibility and purpose and the chance to prove that business could be different, better, more humane. He'd given me the hardest test imaginable, thrown me into deep water and trusted I'd learn to swim. And somehow, against odds that seemed insurmountable, I had. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to honor his memory and build toward a future he'd have recognized and approved of. I pulled out my phone one more time and opened the voice memo app, something I'd started doing in moments of reflection. Grandpa, I said quietly, knowing he'd never hear it but needing to say it anyway, 5 years today. The companies are doing well. Better than well, actually. But more importantly, they're doing good. We're creating jobs that support families. We're innovating without exploiting. We're growing without sacrificing the values you taught me. I know you worried about what would happen after you were gone. Whether I could handle the pressure, whether the work would consume me, or whether I'd compromise to make things easier. I want you to know I'm okay. More than okay. I'm doing work that matters, surrounded by people who care about getting it right, building something that will outlast me just like it outlasted you. I paused, emotions rising. I miss you. I miss our phone calls, our debates, your guidance. There are times I desperately wish I could ask your advice, get your perspective on some impossible decision. But I hear your voice anyway, in my head, reminding me what matters, pushing me to think deeper, see further, care more. You prepared me better than I realized. All those years when everyone else was ignoring me, you were teaching me, shaping me, trusting me. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. Thank you for believing in me before I fully believed in myself. Thank you for giving me this chance to build something meaningful. I hope I'm making you proud. I ended the recording and sat with the silence, feeling the presence of everything my grandfather had built, everything I was trying to preserve and grow. Behind me, the door opened softly. I turned to see my father standing there. Ready to head out? Almost, I said. Just taking a moment. He came and stood beside me at the window. Your grandfather used to do this. End of long days, he'd stand in his study looking out, processing everything. I asked him once what he was thinking about during those moments. What did he say? That he was measuring the distance between who he was and who he wanted to be, between what he'd built and what it should become. He said the gap never closed entirely, but the pursuit of closing it was what kept him honest. I smiled, blinking back tears. That sounds like him. My father put his arm around my shoulders. The gap for you is smaller than you think, sweetheart. You're exactly who he hoped you'd become. We stood there together as the last light faded from the sky. Two people connected by blood and love and shared history, standing in a building that represented hope and work and values that refused to die. Below us, in the parking lot, I could see people leaving, returning to their lives, carrying pieces of this gathering with them. Tomorrow I'd be back in meetings, reviewing reports, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. There would be new challenges, unexpected crises, difficult choices that kept me awake at night. But tonight, for this moment, I let myself feel satisfaction. Not pride exactly, too much humility for that, but quiet recognition that I'd done what my grandfather asked. I'd taken what he built and carried it forward with integrity. I'd stayed true to values that mattered while navigating a world that often didn't value them. I'd proven that being invisible could become power, that being underestimated could become advantage, that quiet competence could eventually become undeniable. 5 years ago, I'd sat in the back row at a funeral, ignored by family who saw me as irrelevant, unaware that my grandfather's letter was about to change everything. Now I stood at the center of his legacy, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, carrying forward work that mattered in ways that extended far beyond any balance sheet. The journey from that back row to this window had been brutal and beautiful, terrifying and transformative. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from lived experience rather than abstract hope, that it was just beginning. Because legacy isn't something you inherit once and then maintain. It's something you build every day through choices that honor the past while creating space for the future. My grandfather had seen me when no one else did. He'd trusted me when I barely trusted myself. He'd given me not just companies but responsibility, not just wealth but purpose, not just opportunity but the chance to prove that another way was possible. And 5 years later, standing in the building his vision had made possible, surrounded by evidence that his faith was justified, I finally understood the greatest gift he'd given me. Not control or authority or financial security, though all those mattered. The greatest gift was showing me that being truly seen, being genuinely valued, being absolutely trusted, changes everything. It changes how you see yourself, how you move through the world, what you believe is possible. I'd been invisible for so long that visibility felt foreign at first, uncomfortable, like clothes that didn't quite fit. But I'd grown into it, learned to carry it with grace rather than arrogance, with responsibility rather than entitlement. And now, 5 years after that funeral that changed my life, I was finally fully comfortable in my own visibility. Not because I needed recognition or validation from others, but because I'd earned it through work that mattered, decisions that honored values, leadership that served people rather than exploiting them. My grandfather would have been proud. I knew that with certainty because I was finally proud of myself, not in an arrogant way, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd risen to an impossible challenge and somehow, against all odds, succeeded. The companies would continue to grow and evolve. New challenges would emerge. The work would never truly be finished. But standing there with my father, looking out at the landscape my grandfather had helped shape, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Deep, genuine, unshakable peace. The kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do, honoring exactly who you are. That was my grandfather's final gift. Not just the companies, but the peace that comes from building something meaningful with your life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.